And this Congress should begin to take a hard look at the failure of long-term capital within a broader context of what's going on in our country and throughout the world. And that is reflective, I think, in some of the policies that Mr. Greenspan and his colleagues have long advocated, which have led us to a situation in which fewer and fewer people with unheard of wealth now have enormous power over the global economy and the lives of billions of people. And the bottom line is that when those folks fail and those folks collapse, they take a whole lot of people with them. And we should really begin to look at the process and how we got to where we are today and question whether that is the direction that we want to continue going in. Now, I, for one, for example, am very concerned about the extraordinarily unfair distribution that exists of wealth, not only in our country, but throughout the world. And I'm going to ask Mr. Greenspan a question about this in a moment. But according to the United Nations, Mr. Chairman, the world's 225 richest individuals have a combined wealth of over $1 trillion, equal to the bottom 47% of the world's population. 225 people have as much wealth as almost half of the world's population. Further, we are now living at a time where of the 100 largest economies in the world, 51 of them are private corporations, again run by a handful of individuals. When we look at institutions like the IMF, we find that a handful of bureaucrats at the IMF have life and death power over dozens and dozens of countries throughout the world. When we look at what's happening in our own country, not to mention the rest of the world, we see in industry after industry, whether it is the banking industry, whether it is the media, whether it is telecommunications, what we see are merger after merger after merger, and fewer corporations run by smaller and smaller groups of individuals who control more and more of the market. And when these people make a mistake, those are mistakes heard all over the world, which affect the lives of billions of people. And I think that laissez-faire attitude that Mr. Greenspan and his colleagues have advocated are leading us into a very, very dangerous situation. Now, my question for Mr. Greenspan is a very simple one. In the United States of America today, you have one man who owns more wealth than 100 million Americans. In the world, you have 225 people who own more wealth than almost half the world's population. Does that concern you? Do you think that that is just? And not only in terms of justice and morality, aren't you concerned about the economic instability that can occur when so few have so much power and when mistakes are made, such as with long-term capital, looking at the economic repercussions of what a few people can do? Does that concern you, Mr. Greenspan?
Well, if you're asking me, would I prefer that there was less concentration of income, less concentration of wealth, I would say yes, generally I would. And I would because I believe that democratic institutions tend to function best when you have fairly even distributions. The question, I think, which is crucial to the issue which is crucial to your question is, what would you do about it, and to what extent would that improve the state of being of the world at large and the individuals who don't have that wealth? It's not by any means clear to me that if you were somehow to take these 225 individuals and merely indicate to them that they no longer have any wealth, and you put them away on a desert island, that the state of the rest of the world would be improved in the slightest. If you're asking me, do individuals who have significant power, and when they make mistakes, does it have consequences to others? That's always been the case throughout history. I think we ought to, instead of looking at what we have now as some incredibly corrupt, unequal, unethical system, is to try to look at what the United States has become relative to what used to exist 100, 200, 300 years ago, I would say to you that the standard of living of the average American is dramatically higher, that the average American is far better off than at any time in our history. And I would suggest to you that that particular state would not be improved by confiscating the wealth of every billionaire in the United States.
No one suggested that. But by the way, you mentioned a moment ago about how I believe I remembering what you said, that the United States has the highest standard of living in the world. This is a country, we have 43 million Americans with no health insurance. We have a situation where the typical married couple family worked 247 more hours in 1996 than in 1989, where real wages have declined in the real last 20 years. But be that it may, my second question, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important for our banking committee because this issue ties into H.R. 10. Now, Mr. Greenspan, as you know, the Fed recently approved the acquisition of Citicorp by Travelers. We all know that Citibank is heavily involved in developing countries, developing markets, a highly troubled sector to say the least. Travelers reported large losses during the recent market turmoil and is now reported to be a major investor in long-term capital. Why shouldn't we be concerned that allowing combinations like Citigroup increases overall risk for financial institutions rather than decreasing risks, which takes us to the whole issue of H.R. 10 and making it easier for large banks to merge with other types of companies? Mr. Greenspan?
Well, first of all, let me just say we process the application according to the law, according to what the statute under which those applications require. We made judgments in all regard. We made judgments about the nature of the merger, and when we believed that all requirements of the law were met, we approved it, as we are required to do. If you're asking the broader question about these larger institutions, one of the reasons why, for example, we, after thinking about it for a while, decided that the basket, the ability of institutions to have very substantial interplay between the non-financial part of the economy and the financial part, which would be significantly enhanced under some of the early versions of H.R. 10, why we opposed, and in retrospect, I think correctly, H.R. 10, as passed by the House of Representatives, in my judgment, was a very good bill. The issue of making certain that all of the new powers are required to be financed in the marketplace at competitive rates, and therefore through an affiliate of a holding company as distinct from, as was originally discussed in many different versions of the bill, through subsidiaries of the bank. I would say that one of the reasons why we are very much concerned that indeed all of these powers be in the holding companies is that we worry about the issue of subsidies coming out of the bank into the subsidiary of the bank and being used in a non-competitive manner to employ expansion of powers which are in H.R. 10. So the answer is yes, I am a little concerned about some of the size of these various institutions, and I think it's very important that we make certain that we don't subsidize them.
Thank you, Mr. Greenspan. Mr. Chairman, I would just conclude by suggesting I think this is an important hearing. I think it lays the groundwork for future hearings in which we should take a hard look at the degree of concentration of ownership in this country and the implication for our national and international economy. Thank you.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I would only add, as the gentleman has noted, that in theory, the particular bailout the Fed has put together does involve a massive amount of concentration of power in one particular hedge fund. And this is a very concerning situation. Mr. Castle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Greenspan, the concerns I had coming into this hearing about the size of these hedge funds and what they can do to our economy has not been exactly quieted